Waterways Area Historical Society, and we're so excited to have you here tonight. Thank you all for coming, and let's go ahead and get started with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we just praise you for this beautiful day, and we praise you for this beautiful place that we get to live in and call home. And just bless all the people that are here tonight, bless their homes, their families, especially those who are battling different illnesses right now. We have members who are a little bit out of commission right now, and so we lift them up. And I lift Mike Cotton up because he's stuck in traffic right now, but he's on his way here. But thank you for just all the blessings in our lives. Help us to just stay focused on you, and you are the one that keeps us going, and we thank you for that, Father. And I thank you for the people here tonight and the program and everything that we have to be so thankful for. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. And I'm going to ask Donald Knapp. Donald's not usually here because Islander Ice Cream is open. And if you have not gone there, you need to go there. Although it's dangerous.
It smells so good.
My sister Mary saw our collection of spoons in our door. She said, "You've been having way too much ice cream." So anyway, but Donald, I'm going to ask Donald to lead. If you all stand, and Donald's going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much. And now I'm going to ask our Vice President, and she's brand new Vice President, and Julie Hosman, and she's been very active already. Come on up, Julie, and I'm going to let you introduce our speaker.
Okay. Thank you, Barbara. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
So I am kind of new to the area, and I have a 10-year-old. So today I took him to go see the Blue Angels. There's two things I learned on this: earplugs and sunblock. Gotta have it, and go early. It was absolutely wonderful. So I would like to introduce our guest speaker. And as I said, I'm Julie Hosman. I am the new VP. And it's an honor to introduce Christian Wagley. He is the coastal organizer for Healthy Gulf, which works on water quality, energy, endangered species, and climate issues along the coast, Northwest and Florida and Southern Alabama. Let's welcome Christian Wagley. Thank you.
So we're going to start out by just going back some number of centuries and just trying to imagine what Pensacola Bay would have been like in its pristine condition. The Pensacola Bay that the native people knew, the Pensacola Bay that the first Spanish explorers would have seen. Because its physical shape is pretty much the way it is today, but the bounty that they would have seen, the bounty was just something that we could never even imagine today. The water, much of the time, probably would have looked like what we see in Santa Rosa Sound or in the Gulf now, much clearer than it is today. And you'd see everything from the shoreline out to 10, 15 feet deep of water. You'd see these dark patches, seagrass beds. Technically, we'd say submerged aquatic vegetation, which is just a huge oasis of life. And then oyster beds so massive up in Escambia Bay and East Bay, Blackwater Bay, that they would rise out of the water at low tide. And there are these accounts of early explorers. I haven't seen those accounts here, but in other bays around where, coming from Europe, they were so amazed at the bounty that there were so many fish they tried to catch them with a frying pan, just literally dipping a frying pan into the water. So that's where we begin, just thinking about that incredible bounty that was there. Some of it's still there, and we're going to talk a little bit about where a lot of that went, and hopefully some hope for getting some of that back. So it's great to be with you all. I've been here once before, and you all have just amazing meetings. I've already had 2 of the cookies, so I wasn't going to get Barbara, thank you. I wasn't going to get my dinner at my regular time, so I figured I'd have that pull me over. And Julie, thanks for the nice introduction with your lovely red face today. It was well worth it to see the Blue Angels, for sure. I grew up outside Annapolis, Maryland. I got to see them, every year, commissioning week there. So that was neat. So I've seen them a lot. I don't go as much anymore because it's a little hard to get out there. I recommend riding a bike now. That's what I do. So, but Orleans. We were founded in Florida back in 1994, but we've been working all that time with people like me all along the Gulf Coast from Florida to over to Texas, working on a variety of water and climate and energy issues here in the Gulf. But I work mostly in Northwest Florida and South Alabama. And yeah, it's just a delight to be able to share a little bit about the history, the natural history of Pensacola Bay, which of course intertwines with the human history and all of that comes together. So come with me and we'll take a little journey here. And so of course we always want to get oriented geographically. You see us in the little red dot up on here on the northern Gulf Coast. And then looking at the bay system that we're talking about, and I say system because we're talking about Pensacola Bay is, that's one part of it, but we call it the Pensacola Bay system. It's a series of interconnected bays. And that includes Santa Rosa Sound and Big Lagoon, and then East Bay, Blackwater Bay up there toward Milton, and then Escambia Bay as well. But it's important to understand, I think a lot of times we forget, but every body of water, there's what we call a watershed. So imagine that big area upland, that upstream, where any drop of water that falls is eventually going to make its way down to that body of water. The good easy analogy is a bathtub, right? If it falls in the bathtub, it's going to go down the water. It's going to go down the drain, right? It's the same thing with a watershed. I grew up Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is 64,000 square miles. Here we're talking about 7,000 square miles, which is a big chunk that goes way up into Alabama. And I think a lot of times for us in Florida, we don't think about that. We just kind of the way our brains work. We see state lines and we don't think about it. And it's hard to work across state lines. It's hard to work with Alabama. We don't know them as well. I know Florida. But the watershed, look at it, most of it's actually up in Alabama. It's actually not in Florida. But we're at the end that gets all the stuff. So everything that falls, every drop of water, potentially anything that hits the ground within that 7,000 square miles, if it can be transported along, it's going to come down here and end up on us and right outside our door here in Gulf Breeze. We know that we have these lovely sand bottom creeks and rivers like the Blackwater River that bisect the land and flow down into rivers like the Escambia River, Blackwater River, Yellow River. Those are the main ones. And that brown color comes from tannins. It's really just kind of like the pigments from pine needles and such, and that's where that gets its name. Right, that base tea color. Sometimes people think there's something wrong with that. That's healthy, and that's the way our freshwater bodies are here in Northwest Florida. So again, just kind of getting oriented geographically, and we look down across the Gulf because it helps to tell the story. We see that big, we call it the shelf or a big bank. That water. Got a little pointer here, right? So I can do working. Oh, it doesn't work on there, does it? I guess that's the thing. It works on the wall, but not on the screen here. But you see this big shelf. They call it the West Florida Shelf. And then it drops off into increasingly deep water. The darker colors are the deeper water. But those are all areas that were, at some point in the past, sea level was lower, and that was all exposed. And in fact, what we call, going back to Pensacola Bay, Escambia Bay, we call it a drowned river valley. Because if you go back far enough, and I'm going to go a little bit of that history, you would have had a river coming down, Blackwater, Yellow River, Escambia River. They would have met somewhere down here. They would have gone out the pass, and they would have gone out on that shelf, and it would have all been forested. It would have been land. The beach would have been 20 miles out or so. And I'm going to show a little bit of that history. So we call it a drowned river valley because this would have been an old river valley, and now the sea level has risen and it's come back and consumed that and literally drowned it. And this is going to show a little bit of that. It may be a little bit hard to see, but let me try to show you what's going on here. There are a series of these different colored lines starting from, well, for us up here. So we're all the way up here. So for us, it would go from south to north, so back towards shore. Here's our little bay system there, Pensacola Bay. This is the West Florida Shelf. So we're starting at 22,000 years ago with that darker, it's almost a blackish gray color right on the edge. And then every 1,000 years, we're looking at increments of sea level rise going back. And the reason sea level rise has risen and fallen over history is there are these things called Milankovitch cycles, which are this interplay between the orbit of the Earth and the way it angles toward the sun, that over thousands and thousands of years, the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth changes very, very slightly. And so when we get into a phase where less sun is hitting the Earth, which is what was which led to the Ice Age here, and again, we've gone back and forth on this many, many times, when the Earth gets less sun, gets a little bit colder slightly, more ice builds up. When ice builds up, it reflects the sun. That makes the planet even colder, and so those things just feed on each other, and they keep doing that over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And then those cycles of the Earth's tilt and the Earth's orbit slowly shift back the other direction, where we start getting more sunlight again, and it's warmer sun. And the planet starts to get warmer again very, very slightly, and that ice starts to melt. And now we're talking about what's going on here, which is the end of the last ice age, 15, 18, 20,000 years ago is what you're seeing here. And that sea level starting to rise back again to become the Florida that we know today, and the beach that we see right out there. But you can see the different increments here every 1,000 years going back. 5,000 years ago, I think, or so is when they say the barrier islands formed, and so I think the rate of sea level rise slowed down around 5,000 years or so, and that 5,000 years ago or so, and that's what allowed Santa Rosa Island. It would have been hard for that island to build up when the sea level was rising very quickly, but it just kind of hit that Goldilocks moment where it was that sweet spot where it was just right. Does anybody know where the sand comes from for Santa Rosa Island? What's that?
Alabama.
Yeah, it's actually coming from. Sure, I'm facing south right now, aren't I? Yeah. It's coming from that direction. So in the course of the year, the sand, on any given day, the sand moves back and forth out there, but in the course of the year, more sand moves this way. So it moves from east to west, just the prevailing winds. The sand is largely coming from the erosion of the bluffs over in Grayton Beach area over there. So if you go over to South Walton County and east of Destin, you see those big high bluffs, and you're actually on the mainland of Florida. You're not on an island there, whereas we're on an island here, and most of Florida is surrounded by islands, but there you're actually on the mainland, south of Chattahoochee Bay. And as that area erodes in storms, that sand gets redeposited, and the currents move it down to make this long linear strip that we know as Santa Rosa Island. That goes right all the way from Destiny's Pass all the way down here, 43 miles, I think. Okaloosa Island is a bogus name. It's just the name that Okaloosa County came up with to distinguish itself from Santa Rosa County, but it's the same island. It's Santa Rosa Island. So yeah, the sea level, like I said, it slowed down 5,000 years ago. It started rising, 18, 20,000 years or so ago to get us back to where we are today. And so we know some of the different ways we know this. One of the things is you may have seen in the news, 10, 15 years ago, there's a real Renaissance man guy over in Alabama, Ben Raines, who has found a lot of things. But he found this underwater forest offshore. If you've heard about that, it's basically a little cypress swamp out there. We know what a cypress swamp looks like today when we see one. And this is kind of showing, that Ice Age coastline, kind of what I showed you before. But there's fish on it. It's been designated like as some kind of a monument now, where you're not supposed to anchor on it or whatever. And preserved, but yeah, these they radiocarbon dated them, and I'm trying to remember. I want to say, did they say 60,000 years ago? I'm trying to remember something like that. I may have that off. But anyway, this underwater forest out there. So there's different ways we know. There's also
How far offshore is it?
Where is it?
off the Alabama coast. And there's one off Mississippi as well. There's probably others that haven't been discovered.
What's it called? We'll look it up.
What's it called? If you just look up underwater forest off
Okay.
Alabama, it will come up.
Thank you.
The question was how far offshore? I'm trying to remember now. I think it's like 10, 20. It's not 50, 60, or 80. It's closer. Yeah, I seem to recall. Yeah, I seem to recall.
Do people go diving there, or is it?
I'm a little confused about that because I think it's somehow the exact site is a secret, but I can't imagine they could keep it a secret. So I don't exactly know what's going on over there with that, if people are visiting it or what they're doing. But I think they, yeah.
So Christian, just so that you know, so it said it's 6 miles off of Gulf Shores.
There we go, thank you. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you for looking that up, yep.
sure.
So,
But don't tell anybody.
so we talked about some of the physical dynamics going on, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the people. So there were various native tribes living here in the southeast, and their arrival date keeps getting pushed back. As we learn more, new sites are found and these sorts of things. So we all grew up the Bering Land Bridge. People came across from the ice age. The sea level was lower. That still holds, but they keep finding sites that are even earlier. Although there is a theory now, they found some other sites as much as 30,000 years ago, and they believe people came on boats along the shore, staying close to shore. They may have followed that Bering Land Bridge area from like northeast Asia, but they were on boats, not on land, which meant, of course, far fewer people came, but there were a few people that came that way, but the vast majority came by walking across the Bering Land Bridge. And when did they get to the southeast? The earliest site I'm aware of down here is, I think, found on the Osceola River 14,000 years ago. So we know about that, and it just means there's other sites out there that just probably haven't been discovered, but we know that one is the earliest. So native people at least have been here along the Gulf Coast for at least probably 14,000 years or so. And they had this, hunter-gatherer, nomadic existence, setting up somewhat temporary camps, and they moved inland to hunt game, and then lived along the shoreline and fished and ate shellfish. And you can always, if you go, it's kind of like when I go camping and you're picking out a campsite. Your natural tendency is you choose high ground overlooking the water. And if you see anywhere along our bays, if you see high ground overlooking the water, you can just about guarantee that it was a native site. And it's just within our DNA. It's a safety security thing. If you know if you're up high, you can see what's coming at you, you can defend it. And you're not thinking about that on a daily basis, but it's embedded in you, and you do make decisions that way. And that's why we choose a campsite the way we do. And if you were setting up a camp, you would tend to choose something kind of up high and allowed you a good view. And so that's largely what they did. The most visible way we see the evidence of the native people that were here is the old shell middens, which is mostly oysters, and you also find shards in there. Does everybody see those along the shoreline here and such? Yeah. And a lot of times it's that high spot overlooking the water where people would have settled for some period of time and shucked oysters for many, many years, and those all just got thrown into a pile along with the broken pots. So yeah, shell middens.
Yeah. When I was a kid, we kind of around the Portofino area, like in Napa, and
Yep.
big dudes up there.
Yep, I found them there as well.
Pot and stuff around.
Yeah.
I don't know, plus or minus, but in that area.
Yep, I have also seen them there, sure have. There's also, this is actually a shell midden, a native site. You can see scallop shells and oyster shells in it that's out off the Big Bend area. So just to give you an example of how we have some idea of native settlement. Some of these middens are on land, but there's also some that are miles offshore that have been buried. So again, that sea level was lower. It started moving. I showed you that kind of progression as it moved back towards shore. But at some point, that coastal plain was wide open out there with forest out there, and people were certainly living out there. And then they've retreated, as they've come as the sea level has
What's
risen.
this word starting with the M you're saying?
Midden, M-I-D-D-E-N.
Thank you.
Yep, shell midden. So we get through kind of some of the native period, and of course we still have native people here. We know about the different Creek tribes here and such. Obviously, totally different time today. But when we look at the first forays of European explorers coming in, it would have been Spanish explorers, and really it's that 1559 expedition. They created it. This is the first map of what became known as the Gulf of Mexico. And if you look at it, you can sort of make it out. Florida was kind of way out. They didn't try to get it down the linear sense of that. And Cuba, probably bigger than, obviously much bigger than it is. But I mean, these are pretty primitive situations that they're working with. The fact that I'm still amazed that you could, in those days and age, with none of the instruments and things we have today, that you could go anywhere and find your way. And then they just always talk about coming back again. I'm just, how could you even have gone anywhere and have any idea where you were, and much less find your way back? I mean, they were incredible what they did. And I think, in the modern age, of course, we get reliant on instruments and things, and so we become far less intuitive. But if you didn't have that stuff, you'd be forced to figure it out, and you figure it out.
They used the stars.
And the star, right.
Which we can't see
Celestial
from
navigation.
Earth anymore.
Yeah.
So is Pensacola, is that the third or the second group of letters up there?
Up here?
Yeah.
I actually don't know. I've not tried to make that legible to me. I mean, yeah, we're certainly somewhere right around in that area there, but I can't quite tell. Has everybody read The Gulf by now, Jack Davis's book? I mean, if you haven't, that is the seminal book on the Gulf. He came through here 7 or 8 years ago doing the research on it. I helped him. It's nice to put my name in there, but it won a Pulitzer Prize. I mean, you all live here. Everybody should read The Gulf, and it's extensive chapters on the Spanish explorers coming in.
So it takes the whole perimeter of the Gulf, down Mexico, everything, the Gulf?
Yeah, there's probably, I'm trying to think less, it's US focused.
Okay.
I'm trying to remember how much coverage there is of Mexico, but it is the seminal book written on the Gulf, but it's definitely US oriented. And like I said, it won a Pulitzer, so it's very well respected.
Jack Davis?
Jack Davis,
Thank
University of Florida, yeah. He since wrote a book on bald eagles.
Thank you.
And then we have De Luna, which everybody knows, we've got a lot of business. I think if I was opening a business, I wouldn't name it Dr. De Luna, because there's already so many the Luna and the Blue Angels, we love them, you know, but there's already a lot of stuff out there, so maybe pick something out. But you know, the Luna's the one that gets all the attention. So Tristan de Luna, 1559, you know, 1,500 people or so. They came over from Veracruz, Mexico, a couple of hundred Aztecs, some Africans, both enslaved and free people, and I think we all know the basic story now. They ended up over there on East Pensacola Heights, almost where high ground overlooking the water. There was also a freshwater source there, right, that they could draw from. And they eked out existence for a year and a half or so, and then went back to Veracruz. Not successful. So of course we fight about the St. Augustine method. I didn't grow up here, so I don't really fight about that. I mean, if you grow up here, maybe you have more stake in the, whatever. But I mean, St. Augustine's settlement was permanent, and they built a lot more stuff earlier than we did. So 1559, and then nobody European came back till 1698. So it was a big long interval. But it's interesting when they dig over there, they do find that they were eating conchs and they were eating oysters. I've not seen any records of fish bones. There's records that they brought fish nets with them. So I don't know if fish bones don't last that long in the soil. Oyster shells and scallop shells would still be here 450 years later. It could be the bones are gone. There are parts of fish, otoliths, which is like these little ear bones and some other things, and teeth that might last that long. I haven't asked the archaeologists. I don't know what the deal is with that. I do know, and if you read the book The Gulf by Jack Davis, he'll talk about these Spanish explorers in the Gulf with this bounty that we cannot even imagine, and they're starving to death. Surrounded by a bounty that we cannot, because they were used to eating land animals. They weren't used to eating stuff out of the sea was not their thing. It was just amazing to imagine being in the Gulf with a fish we cannot even imagine, and they're starving. But they were. But here they did eat shellfish for sure, and I'm not sure about the fish part, but certainly the shellfish are a lot easier to catch. You just pick them up.
Right.
Fish are harder to catch. So I want to take you to one of the very first big changes that really started to change our bay system, Pensacola Bay system, and really every body of water for us here in the Southeast, and that is the forest industry and the progression, and starting in really the mid-19th century, of the cutting of the native forest in America, which would have begun where the settlers came in, of course, in the Northeast and in those original 13 colonies. And when that was exhausted, that effort started to move into the Southeast. And so it came through the Carolinas and Georgia, and then it just worked its way. I mean, we were a little bit later along on that, but it worked its way over our way. This was longleaf pine. Longleaf pine was the dominant tree in the southeastern forest on the coastal plain, which is going to be that darker color there. So from the coast in a certain number of miles, and then farther inland it was somewhat of a mixed forest. But this is the longleaf pine forest went from southeastern Virginia all the way to East Texas, and originally covered between 60 and 90 million acres. It's only about 3 million acres today. It's considered the most decimated ecosystem in North America. And at the time, they're just like, oh no, there was no comprehension that we could ever run out of any of this. But even considering the relatively primitive tools we had to cut with at the time and everything, they did cut it, and they worked their way through. And these are my house is built from that. All the old houses in downtown Pensacola, they're all built from that. Your part pine. It's mostly the longleaf. They built little canals and things to float that down. Baghdad was a big one. You find these little towns all on the coast. They were #1 in lumber imports, but it's always a brief period, because you're cutting all down. You can only be #1 and then it moves to the next town down the road, and kind of those boom and bust cycles. And eventually, that's what we ended up with. They actually had a conference in the 1920s called the Cut Over Lands Conference. They kind of like, what the hell do we do now? We cut it all down. And they did this thing. They developed this system, the thing called destructive distillation. They went out and got the stumps. You bring those back, and I think Armstrong and something in Bayou Chico was part of that. They bring them in there and they could boil them out to get the resins and stuff, turpentine and such out of them.
So Christian, I mean, they had the knowledge, obviously, with farming to let a field go fallow so it could kind of reconstitute, they could rotate crops so they wouldn't burn it out. They weren't planting like small pine trees and kind of doing that yet?
No, there was no replanting back in those days.
And those seedlings took, I mean,
There would have been a certain amount of that, but the reason the longleaf pine forest didn't come back was the exclusion of fire.
Mm.
And so we thought fire was bad. We didn't understand fire, the ecological role it had. You would have lightning strikes, and native people used it. And these forests where we live here would have burned every 3 to 5 years, wetter areas at a longer interval. And fire is absolutely critical to them. So far from destroying it, there's a whole bunch of the grasses and the flowers and plants in there that can't even reproduce without a fire. Imagine that. That's how dependent they are on fire. They cannot even reproduce without that. So other species were planted, slash pine. They thought they grew faster in the beginning than longleaf, so the industry started to favor that. And that's why the longleaf went from 60 to 90 million acres to 3 million acres. Fire exclusion, and then we started planting. When we did plant, we planted other species. We planted slash pine largely, and not longleaf. The longleaf's the most ecologically diverse terrestrial landscape in North America. So if you go on the, I have a picture at the end here of a good longleaf forest, but a longleaf savanna would be longleaf pines above with herbaceous, not woody, but herbaceous vegetation beneath, and these are areas that would burn like every 1 or 2 or 3 years. And there's a way of sampling in botany where you drop a square meter on the ground and you count and identify every single plant or animal or whatever inside that square meter, and you do that in different places and you get an idea of things. It's an ecological sampling tool. And they did that in the eastern coastal plain in North Carolina, and like a 1 square meter plot, there was something like 200 species of plants in 1 square meter. And these are like, some of these are tiny, you know what sundews are, and some of these are just tiny little plants. That was a lot of work for somebody to identify all of them, but it was like a couple hundred species, extremely ecologically diverse. The good thing about the old forestry was they didn't herbicide it. I mean, they didn't have herbicides then, so they just cut all the trees down, but all the stuff, so much of the life in our original forest here is in the ground cover. The trees were almost all longleaf pine. It was very much monoculture because it could survive the fire. All the diversity was down here, and because they didn't herbicide and such, they didn't destroy that. That came later. Once you got into the 20th century and they got the herbicides, then they started destroying the ground cover stuff as well. That's a lot harder to get back than the trees. So and what happened when we cut all the trees? You opened up the land to erosion. You started to get a lot of the soils washing in, burying creeks and rivers and such like that. That was relatively minor compared to what came later, and really what came later, really starting, I think, for us here, sorry, some kind of reminder or something. The industrialization that really began, I believe the first year, I think, would have been 1939 or so, when it wasn't International Paper then, but the paper mill went in on discharging 11 Mile Creek into Perdido Bay, not Pensacola Bay. St. Regis maybe it was called at the time, I can't remember, if you go back far enough. But this is, what's that?
St. Regis then
Champion.
Yeah, multiple different names. This is the old, what we call Ascend today, originally would have been Chemstrand, I believe, probably, Monsanto, right? If you go back far enough, I don't remember when this started, 40s or 50s or so, this is an early image of it. And as was common of all industries in the day, you just discharged your ditches, or you had a pipe that went right out into in this case, the Escambia River.
Yep.
And that's just how it was done until the Clean Water Act came in 1972 and started to transition away from this to other types of discharges. But that really was the biggest change to our bay system, was that post-World War II industrialization, all the different factories came in, and then also combined with poor wastewater treatment. And together you get things like this.
Yeah.
And so some of you may be old enough to remember, if you grew up here, Bayou Jahar, like in the 60s up until the early 70s, millions of dead fish, usually menhaden. This was very common here. Again, some of this was caused by industry, but a lot of it was caused by wastewater treatment. So it was sewage treatment plants that were not properly treating, and this caused a drop in oxygen. When you throw all that out in the water, the bacteria go crazy. When the bacteria go crazy, they also die en masse, and it robs the water of oxygen. All the bacteria rob the water of oxygen, and so that's what caused the fish kills. Was not the sewage, and probably a lot of times maybe not chemicals, but the low oxygen. The plummeting of oxygen levels, and the fish would die. So a lot of our history of our bay and our area can be measured through our natural resources, and so. We're all aware, we're very famous for red snapper capital of the world, and we had the snapper smacks down along the waterfront. It was one of the early things that we shipped out of the port, or came in and out of the port of Pensacola, and really downtown Pensacola. But interestingly, we did what we always do with all natural resources, is we over-harvested. And so it's a little hard to see on here, but in the beginning, they were catching all the fish right off Pensacola. And then they fished that out, and they had to go up Port St. Joe. Then they would fish off Tampa, and by the end, they were sailing 3 days due south to the Campeche banks off Mexico, and that's where they were catching the red snapper. And I think eventually there was a little bit off of Texas or something later on. And it went up until like the 60s or so, until it was so fished out, there just wasn't much commercial fishery out of Pensacola and I think most of the Gulf. And since that time now, the federal government passed a law, Congress passed a law in 1976 called the Magnuson Act. Basically makes it illegal to overfish, sets up these councils, manage fish, and scientific-based management. You're not supposed to overfish. And that's where all the fight is now. The recreational fishermen want to catch more, commercial fishermen want to catch more, and the allocation and all that stuff. Our organization's not really involved in that. We just don't want to see overfishing. But the reason that people now is that there's red snapper everywhere. There's red snapper everywhere. I don't know. I don't go out there. It probably feels that way compared to before. But the fish are not big enough, and the fishery managers are trying to get these big old fish because they produce so many more eggs than the younger fish. They're managing the fishery to keep you from catching and keeping fish of a certain size so that they'll get to those big ones, because the big ones make so many more eggs. They're so much more productive, and this shows at different ages how many eggs that they produce. The scientists, there's a term in biology called fecund, F-E-C-U-N-D. It basically means like fertility, and the biologists say something like big fat fecund females or something. They have some initials they use or something like that. They want to get to those big old female fish that produce so many eggs, and that's what they're managing for. And so another really important thing to understand, this is in the Gulf. It's a little hard to see, but Florida and over mouth of the Mississippi River in Louisiana. But this is a map of what we call primary productivity. So everything you eat comes from the sun. Everything that runs in nature, it all comes from the sun. It all comes from the sun. Primary productivity, right, is the ability of plants to capture that energy and make it into something, a plant that then gets eaten by something else, right? And that's the base of the food chain. What you're seeing here is primary productivity in the Gulf. And where it's where it's the richest is where it's red. Where it's the least is blue. So when you go out in the Gulf 60 miles, it's like a desert out there, actually. It's so little productivity. If you've ever been out, you can see that in the water. That's that deep blue water is like a desert. Green is richer, and the red is the real hot spot. And what you see where we live,
60?
relatively low productivity. And you can tell this by the color of the water. And I use the term gumbo. So we go out here, we have that blue-green water. It's relatively low in productivity. It doesn't produce nearly the volume of seafood that you get over in Louisiana. That's why as soon as you cross over in Alabama, you see far more fishing boats, wholesale seafood places, all that, and that water starts looking like gumbo. It's that murky stuff. So you don't really want to swim in that as much as you like to swim in our water. But biologically, it's way more productive, and that's because there's nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus in there that feed those little tiny plankton, and everything feeds off of that eventually. That's the base of the food chain. That's the primary productivity. And so this is also reflected in our bay. So Pensacola Bay is relatively clearer water historically, maybe not so much now, less productivity, less biologically productive compared to bays over there in Mississippi, Alabama, Mississippi, and into Louisiana. Oysters are a good one to talk about because a lot of us love oysters, we love to eat them, and they were a huge part of our bay. And sadly, they've been decimated here. There's no more commercial harvest as of the last, at least the last 5-6 years or so. Actually, I think it's more like 15 years. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
You can see some of the reflections, some of the landings here. You see the blue marks where the remaining beds are. I think we went from historically they estimate 15,000 acres of oyster beds to less than 500 acres now.
Wow.
So that's pretty decimated. So overharvesting, pollution, the sediment that runs off dirt roads, construction sites, that's a big one. It smothers the oysters. They can't move. If the conditions are not right, they can't move, right? And they can literally get buried by that stuff. Hurricanes can hurt it as well. They admit, the oysters admit it. I think they blame some of the untimely oyster, I'm not sure, but when the BP disaster happened and the oil was coming this way, they went out and over-harvested it because they thought they were going to lose it all anyway. And part of the problem with over-harvesting is you take over, not only do you take, oysters away that need to be there to reproduce, but you change the structure of the whole. It's based on the oysters rising up in the water column and getting where that water moves and being up high. When you take too many, it just goes back down into that low spot where the sediment is, and so you change the physical structure of the reef. And this is what the oysters do that's incredible. They'll set up these little experiments with cloudy water, and the one without oysters, nothing happens, and the one with...
Was there an incident between, say, 85 and there's like a big spike there, where like at 85 and it goes down? What happened there?
That's a great question, and I don't know the answer to Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember, there wasn't a big hurricane in there that would have caused anything.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if, a lot of times there could be a weather event, either very, very wet period or very, very dry period or something that throws things off. That's a good, I'll have to, if I can find somebody that might know that, it's a good thing to ask about, but I do
There
not
was a hurricane
have
in
the
there.
answer.
There was a hurricane in
There was like Elena or something, wasn't there, in '85? I don't think it was a big
I
thing
was
for
at
us.
Spring Hill, anyway.
Was it Opal?
That was Gainesville.
Was it?
And yeah, what oysters do is incredible in clearing the water. The water should be clearer than it is. It's getting too many nutrients in it from what? Lawns, sewage treatment plants, septic tanks, fertilizer from lawn, all those things, stormwater runoff. So the water is murkier and browner in the bay than it should be. It should be clearer than it is. And you can watch it every fall. We'll go through a period, you know, the dry time of year here is that September, October period. I've seen the bay look like almost like the Gulf, even in recent times. You don't get rain for 4 or 5 weeks. But historically, the oysters did a whole big part of that. And I don't know the statistic here, but I grew up in the Chesapeake Bay, and the oysters were so decimated there. The oysters used to filter the entire volume of the bay in 3 days. That's how many there were. And then by the time in the 80s, when I was growing up, it took them a year to do it. So the Chesapeake Bay and then Pensacola Bay has lost all that filtering capacity that makes life better for everything else in the bay. Especially seagrass beds, which I'll talk about in a minute. This was our first oyster farmer here. We're getting those now. Donnie McMahon, he's since sold, but this was the one off Scenic Highway. There's now, I think, 5 of these in the bay. They're trying to make up for some of that gap, and they are to some degree, but they're still struggling. There's a farmer out here by the Garson Point Bridge that's lost his entire crop at least once in a heat wave, if not twice. But with the cage system, they can control. What happened to Donnie was we got a big freshwater event, and his cages were, I guess we're at the surface. Yeah, they were surface. So salt water is dense, and so it tends to stay at the bottom, and the fresh water tends to float on top of that. So he had his cages out, and we got a huge rain event, or multiple days of rain event, and the salinity dropped, and it killed his entire crop. Since that time, he adjusted. I don't know what the other farmers do. I assume they do the same thing. The ability to move them up and down in the water column, because if you can drop them down at the bottom, it's saltier down there, and that will save them. So
Avalon Aquaculture's out there too. Avalon Aquaculture.
yeah, that's my friend Shayna.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's great.
Her
She's over in
video's
Scandia
on
Bay.
YouTube also
Okay,
with
yeah.
Carol. Anyways,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Excuse
So
me.
yeah, you live and learn, but
Right.
that's what they do now. And there's projects going on, mostly for environmental reasons, where they're going out and some of you may have seen the oyster shells being saved at restaurants and that sort of thing. Because again, oysters, they're going to spawn, and they're these little tiny larval stages floating around, and they have to land on something hard. They can't do anything on sand or silt or anything. It has to be hard. And the main thing they need to go on is old oyster shells. And we took a lot of that away when we caught oysters and harvested oysters, and you have to put that back. And a lot of times they put rocks in it and all that stuff to simulate as well. But these are bags of oyster shells going out to do that. There's our seagrass bed. So this is what those oysters are making conditions better for, making water clearer for. If you go out on a boat, even if you walk the shoreline, if you fly in, you see those dark patches on the bottom. And any fisherman knows that's where you don't usually fish on a bare sand area. You go to the grass beds.
Right.
And if you go along, there's some unbelievable figures, like an acre of seagrass, like how many hundreds of thousands of fish and crab. It is incredible compared to a bare sand bottom. But we have lost historically about 90% of that in our bay system. And the main place it still has hung on is in Santa Rosa Sound and Big Lagoon, because those were farther from the industries and they were closer to the pass where they were flushed more, so the water quality didn't diminish as much there. But they are precious. They really probably kind of bottomed down in the 80s and 90s. They were just for the first time, maybe in the last 5 years, starting to see some recovery of these seagrass. But this is like totally critical. If we ever get this back, and the oysters, the conditions will be incredible back in our bays again. They'll be prettier, they'll be clear. The amount of marine life will just be incredible compared to what we've been used to now. I mean, this is like imagine taking away 90% of your lungs and still trying to breathe. I don't know, maybe you could still breathe, but you'd be in pretty critical, dire conditions. So, yeah, just an oasis of life. And that's turtle grass, the thicker stuff that's higher salinity down more toward the pass. But there's about 5 species of again, we call it submerged aquatic vegetation in the bays and all the way up to the mouths of the rivers. It's just a total oasis of life. Things go in there to hide. Crabs go in there to molt. When crab is molting, it's vulnerable. It can't defend itself, so it goes up in there where it can hide. And it's just full of life in there. There's all kinds of tiny life living on the blades of the grass. I mean, it is just a fascinating ecosystem there. And scallops, I'll be out there in a few weeks, 2 weeks maybe, does anybody do the scallop survey here? Do it for the University of Florida Extension every summer. So I'll go out to Big Sabine Point And we usually don't find any. There used to be some here historically, but we might this year because we've had 2 years of lower than average rainfall. It's just the water's not salty enough here for them to be happy the way they are in Port St. Joe and St. Joe Bay. The salinity's much higher there. They get very little fresh water coming in, and so that's the challenge for us. But yeah, I'll be out there snorkeling and hopefully find some because they're just cool. They're just cool little critters. So we're trying to wrap it up here. Start looking at, I talked about the land use changes on land when we cut the forests. Then we had the industry come in, but then really what's driving changes in our bay today and the water quality of our bay and challenging its ability to recover is what's happened to land. If you look at Pensacola, you just see the transition of the old way of building cities with the street grid like this. And those communities largely had people's daily needs nearby within walking distance. There wasn't much of a need to drive. There was a lot less land consumed when we did that. In the post-war, when you start seeing the post-war suburban pattern where the streets start doing cul-de-sacs, they don't connect anymore. And really what happened, these are national figures, but in the period from like 1950 to 1990, in that post-World War II period, the standards changed, everything favored that sprawl, that spread out pattern, separating our daily needs separating our daily needs from us, so it forced us to get in the car. And so population grew in that 40 years or so, 40, 50 years after World War II, it grew by 92.4%, but the amount of land we were consuming grew 245%, right? Bigger houses, bigger lots.
Further away.
If you go to a commercial building now, I got one in here. Well, yeah, it's all, it was all about the car. The government also published standards that showed how to lay out neighborhoods, and it went from, having the corner store and the things nearby to big box stores down the road. And when you do that, if you go to one of these, if you look at them from the air, the parking lots, it's actually more of a parking lot than a building.
Yeah.
If you look, parking lots are typically like 2 or 3 times the size of the actual building.
With no trees for shading.
No trees, usually, yeah. And so, where does that water all go? I mean, since 1984, you're supposed to capture some of it, but a lot of it still goes down storm drains. Some of the old stuff is untreated, but even the new stuff the storm water systems can't remove everything, especially nutrients. Remember we talked about that brown water, that gumbo. Nutrients are good in the right amount, but almost all of our water bodies now have too much nitrogen and phosphorus in them. It causes that green pea soup. It causes it to be too murky, too full of plankton, more than it should be. And
no
stormwater,
oysters to clear it out.
What's that?
No oysters to clear it out.
Yeah, and that we're lacking that as well. So, but the stormwater facilities don't do a great job of removing nutrients because they're dissolved in the water. There's some new standards in the state now, and they're having to increase that because that's probably the #1 polluter of our bodies of water is too much nitrogen and phosphorus. I mean, you see these stormwater facilities catching some of that water. A lot of that's for flood control, and there is some pollutant removal, but it's not really enough to keep the bays from being harmed. So our original, forest here, this is again the longleaf pine forest. This is the least, I like to say, it's the least polluting land use, right? I mean, there's almost all that water comes down. A lot of it's broken by the branches and the stems and the leaves or the needles on the trees. And then what hits the ground filters through the shrubs. A lot of that evaporates off and doesn't even make it into the ground. But it's like a big sponge. The more of this we have, the better the quality of our water. But we're losing it. And I think we've lost. Second. I looked. Santa Rosa County lost 22 square miles of forest from 1996 to 2021. This was growth and expansion. So 22 square miles of stuff like that. So that's the big sponge that we need. And I'm afraid that there's some things we can do now that mitigate some of the damage and help soften, like better stormwater facilities. But some of this won't end until the population grows fast. It just won't. And we are having the growth now that used to be in South Florida because we have much more land available than they do in South Florida. And it's actually, even though it's gotten expensive here, it's cheaper here than it is down there. So we're seeing that growth. I think Santa Rosa County is 6th or 7th in the top 10 for growth. So another thing, as I get toward wrapping up here, that's going on is just the rate of change along our shorelines is really dramatically changing with sea level rise. And so there's a gauge they can measure sea level going back thousands of years through, we'd call it a proxy. You can do it with the ice, you can look at ice, you can look at rocks and coral and various things that measure that. But the gauges have been in place for a century or more, and so there's one at the Port of Pensacola that's been continuously every day monitoring the level of the water here since 1923 or 4, so we have a neat century of data. And in that time, the water went up about 10 inches vertically, which doesn't sound like much, but on a shallow shoreline, 10 inches this way means can mean hundreds of feet. It just depends on how steep that shoreline. And most of our shorelines are pretty shallow here. So that sea level rise is now accelerated, really starting in the early to mid 90s. So we're going to have that same 10 inches that happened in the last 100 years in the next 30 years. So it's 3 times faster, and that's baked in. Beyond that, it's really going to depend on how fast we transition away from fossil fuels. That's what's driving it. The ice is melting. 2 things are happening. As the planet gets warmer due to the burning of coal, oil, natural gas, originally the biggest issue was the thermal expansion of water. So remember we learned in high school science class, if water gets warmer, it expands, the molecules expand, and it expands in volume, and that causes the ocean to go up. That's what was driving most of the sea level rise on Earth up until, I think, the last 20, 30 years or so. Now it's being driven by the melting of ice on land. That has accelerated dramatically. And so that's why they say that 10 inches in the last 100 years is not going to happen in the next 30. There's no stopping that. It's beyond that what we do. But we are going to have to be smarter with our shorelines and look at things like living shorelines and maybe moving some things out of the way. But this is a scene along our bay here, like in Naval Live Oaks there, as you see forests getting drowned as that sea level rises. So, and they're doing things, like living shorelines, putting out rocks, breaking some of the wave action, and this can soften and mitigate it. It can't hold the shoreline completely in one place forever, but it can soften it and slow it down and mitigate it and provide some good habitat for oysters and other critters as well. And so I'll just wrap up with, hey, what's my favorite critter in the Pensacola Bay system? I would say Gulf sturgeon, which if you don't know about them, they are an endangered species, and they swim up into our way up into our rivers and find limestone, so some rocks on the bottom, and that's where they'll spawn. And they've got a lot of them radio collared. They go up in the Yellow River, Blackwater River, and Escambia River as well. But they are an endangered species, and there's a lot of our endangered species are under attack right now. There's a lot of things that have been going on at the administration level in Washington and even Congress as well, and so a lot of protections have been removed. The latest one was they just removed, ever since the Endangered Species Act has been around over 50 years, part of the definition of harming an endangered species and taking it, meaning kind of killing it, was destroying its habitat. That just changed last week. It was announced. So what you can't do is go out and spear one of those, right? That's illegal, and that's still illegal, but you can destroy it. As of last week, you can destroy its habitat. Even though everybody understands that if you take the habitat away, it can't survive. So if you went and removed all that limestone that it's spawning on, that's the only thing it can spawn on. It's been spawning on it for thousands of years. That would not be considered harm. But it's being litigated, and that'll all go through, and we'll see how that all shakes out. But I'll wrap up with that, and
the rice is
happy to
well.
take any questions. So.
The rice as well.
Well, I didn't talk about that because I was focused on the
I
bay.
know, but I was 50 years old before I knew
think I
that
ran
there
over
was a
anyway.
whale in the Gulf of Mexico.
What's that?
I was 50 before I knew there was a whale lived in the Gulf of
Yeah,
Mexico.
most people didn't know.
Most
till
people don't know.
5 years ago.
So everybody knows.
Chris, I just have a random question about shrimping in the bay. I remember you see a lot of shrimp on, is that banned now?
Is it banned, you say?
Are there still commercial shrimpers out there? I don't see boats out there.
Yeah, I saw one the other day, but it's very few.
Okay.
If you don't know, Rick O'Connor is the Marine Extension Agent for Escambia County. He wrote an incredible piece profiling what happened. It's largely due to the rising competition from cheap imports, which is largely like farm stuff from South America and Asia, and all the costs on these fishermen here of gas and insurance, going down the list, they can't compete with it. So it's just not worth going out. So they're going out. I think there's shrimp to be caught, but they're not going out because of that. And he shows like the dramatic decline for Pensacola Bay.
Yeah.
Specifically, if you read, he's got a piece online, if you find it, if you Google it, showing the decline in landings and all, and it's just a collapse of that. And I think there's shrimp to be caught, but it's not worth catching them because it's not really viable. Well, thanks y'all. I enjoyed the visit very much.
You're good.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Christian. That was great. Let's give him another round of applause.
And cookies. And cookies.
Yeah, and the rice's whale was that. I never knew there were whales in the Gulf. And Teresa, thank you.
It's on
so
YouTube.
much. She records these meetings, so if you know people that couldn't come tonight, they can. Now it takes a little while for it to get on there, but that is so great to have that resource, and so you can go back and watch
Homemade.
That's our low-cost gift that we can give to, but I'm happy to do that. That was great. Well, we're gonna move along, and